The orphanage door closed behind Madison with a heavy, almost definitive sound. The cold morning wind seemed to push her back, as if the world outside wasn't ready to receive her yet. Carrying only a small suitcase and the heart-shaped pendant around her neck, Madison took a deep breath, ignoring the lump in her throat. The road to the Harris mansion started here. It was her first day beyond the walls that had both sheltered and imprisoned her for 19 years. When the employment agency's car stopped in front of the mansion's imposing iron gate, Madison felt her hands grow clammy. She had never seen anything so grand. The estate looked like a scene pulled from a movie. Pristine gardens stretched to the main entrance, with trees pruned into meticulous shapes and a fountain in the center, its crystal-clear water shimmering in the light. "So this is it," she murmured, adjusting the collar of her coat. The main door creaked open softly, revealing a tall man with a stern face and penetrating gaze. Joseph, the mansion's head butler, didn't need to say a word for Madison to understand that he was the type of person who did not tolerate mistakes. He examined her from head to toe, lingering longer than he should on the pendant around her neck. "You're late," was his only greeting. His voice was cold, as if the very air had chilled around him. "The traffic." "I'm sorry, sir," Madison replied, trying to sound steady, even as her legs felt weak. "Joseph is sufficient. Come with me," he said, spinning on his heels without even looking back. Madison hurried after him, her shoes echoing against the gleaming marble floor. The mansion's interior was even more impressive than the exterior. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, rugs that looked like works of art covered the floors, and massive paintings adorned the walls, featuring portraits of the Harris family's ancestors. Everything was silent, as if the entire house were holding its breath. "You will work in the East Wing, helping clean and organize the empty rooms," Joseph announced abruptly, stopping in front of a heavy wooden door. He turned the handle and stepped into what appeared to be a small, almost hidden but cozy bedroom. "This will be your quarters. I expect no noise or mess. There are rules in this house. Breaking them will not be tolerated." "Yes, sir, I mean Joseph," Madison answered, trying to absorb the information as she watched him carefully. The butler narrowed his eyes. His expression was a mix of suspicion and something else, something Madison couldn't identify. "There's something about you," he murmured, as if speaking to himself. "Excuse me?" she asked, confused. Joseph said nothing. He merely adjusted his shirt cuffs and left the room, leaving Madison alone with the silence and oppressive walls. The young woman looked around. The room was simple, with a narrow bed, an old wooden wardrobe, and a small window overlooking the garden. She sat on the bed and took a deep breath, exhaling slowly as if trying to purge all her insecurity from the day. She opened her suitcase, pulling out a few plain clothes, and finally held onto the heart pendant, now cold against her skin. "It's going to be okay," she whispered to herself. The first hours of work were difficult. Joseph watched her critically with every move, pointing out any detail that wasn't perfect. The other staff, though polite, seemed to keep their distance. She felt like an intruder in that magnificent place. When the day finally ended, Madison returned to her room exhausted and with sore hands. She looked out the window. The sky was filled with stars, but the mansion remained dark and impenetrable, like a sleeping giant. A soft knock on the door made her heart race. "Madison," called a voice from the other side. It was Joseph. His voice sounded even harsher at night. She opened the door cautiously. "Tomorrow, 6 o'clock sharp, I expect you to be ready. There's no room for delays or mistakes here," he said, looking at her as if still trying to figure her out. His eyes lingered once again on the pendant. "That necklace? It's all I have left of my family," Madison replied quickly, clutching the piece between her fingers. For a moment, Joseph looked disturbed, but he quickly regained his rigid posture. "Good night," he said curtly, disappearing down the dark hallway. Madison shut the door and leaned against it, feeling her heart race far too quickly. Something about that house felt off. Joseph treated her with a distrust she couldn't understand, and the weight of that necklace felt heavier than ever. She lay down, clutching the pendant against her chest, and closed her eyes. "It's going to be okay," she repeated softly, but this time her voice sounded less certain. Outside, the Harris mansion remained silent, but something, or someone, was awake, hidden in the shadows. Madison woke up before sunrise just as Joseph had ordered. The morning chill crept into her small room, and she felt the weight of the previous day pressing on her shoulders. At the orphanage, she was used to a grueling routine, but there was something about the Harris mansion that made every task feel more oppressive, as though the walls carried secrets too heavy to bear. With hurried steps, she crossed the dark hallways of the house. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of her shoes against the cold marble floor. The mansion was still asleep, but Joseph was already waiting for her in the main hall, immaculate in his black uniform. "Punctuality is the bare minimum I expect from you," he said, without even looking in her direction. Madison nodded, feeling small under the butler's harsh gaze. "Today you'll be responsible for the empty rooms on the 3rd floor. I want every corner shining. Understood?" "Yes, sir." "I mean Joseph," she corrected herself quickly. "Good, get started." Madison climbed the wide staircase, feeling Joseph's eyes on her, until she disappeared down the upper hallway. On the 3rd floor, the rooms were shrouded in white sheets, hiding old and luxurious furniture. The dust that had gathered revealed neglect, yet there was something solemn about those rooms, as though time had stopped there. As she carefully dusted an intricately carved piece of furniture, a painting on the wall caught her attention. She stepped closer, wiping the fine layer of dust away with the sleeve of her blouse. The painting depicted a small child with curly hair and a sweet smile, holding a heart-shaped necklace. Madison felt a chill creep up her spine. That necklace. It's the same as mine, she thought, instinctively touching the pendant hanging around her neck. Her heart pounded. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The girl in the painting had the same large, expressive eyes that she saw in the mirror every morning. "What are you doing?" Joseph's deep voice echoed down the hallway. Madison jumped and spun around. Joseph stood in the doorway, his eyes fixed on her as though he could see the thoughts running through her mind. I was cleaning the painting," Madison stammered, avoiding his gaze. Joseph walked toward her slowly, his eyes never leaving her, like a predator studying its prey. He glanced at the painting for a moment and then looked back at the necklace around her neck. "That necklace. Where did you get it?" he asked, his voice low and firm but filled with a tension that frightened her. "It's mine. I've always had it," Madison replied, taking an involuntary step back. "They told me at the orphanage that I was found with it when I was a baby." Joseph fell silent for a moment. Something in his eyes shifted as though a veil had been lifted, revealing an expression Madison couldn't decipher. Then he abruptly turned and walked toward the door. "Finish your work and stay away from things that don't concern you," he said before leaving, shutting the door behind him and leaving Madison alone with the painting. Her hands trembled as she gripped the duster. Questions began to flood her mind, one after another. Who was the girl in the painting? Why was she wearing the same necklace as Madison? And why did Joseph seem so unsettled by it? The rest of the day passed in a haze. Madison completed her tasks on autopilot, her thoughts consuming her attention. Joseph continued watching her from afar, his eyes filled with growing suspicion. Each time she passed him, Madison felt a chill run down her spine, as though something invisible hung between them. That night, after finishing her duties, she returned to her small room. Exhaustion weighed her down, but sleep felt impossible. Lying in bed, she held the pendant between her fingers, feeling its familiar, cold metal. "Who are you?" she whispered to the necklace, as though expecting an answer. Outside, the wind whistled through the trees in the garden, and for the first time, Madison felt that this place, so grand and luxurious, hid something dark. Joseph knew something about her. She was certain of it. And somehow the necklace was the key to understanding the mystery that was beginning to unravel. In the darkness of the hallway, Joseph stood outside Madison's room like an unmoving shadow. He remained there for minutes, listening to the heavy silence on the other side of the door. His eyes narrowed, and his hardened face reflected something that looked like remorse, or perhaps just fear. The next morning dawned with a different energy at the Harris mansion. There was more movement in the hallways, a restless coming and going among the staff, and it didn't take Madison long to realize that something important was about to happen. "Mr. William is returning from his trip today," informed one of the older maids, Rose. as she carefully arranged the porcelain dishes in the kitchen. "You better stay out of his way, girl. The master likes things his way, and Joseph won't forgive you if you get in the way." Madison nodded silently, though she couldn't contain her curiosity. Until now, the name William Harris had sounded like a distant, almost mythical entity. The man who owned that enormous house, who employed dozens of people, and whose authority seemed to echo through every wall. In the early afternoon, the sound of a powerful engine announced William's arrival. Madison was in the garden, tending to the plants at Joseph's request, when the black car drove through the main gates. She looked up at the exact moment a man of commanding presence stepped out of the vehicle. William Harris had neatly combed graying hair, wore a dark suit, and carried himself with the posture of someone used to being obeyed. Even from a distance, Madison felt the weight of his presence. Joseph appeared immediately, bowing slightly in a welcoming gesture. William said something to him in a low voice, and the butler seemed to agree, casting a quick glance toward Madison before leading his employer into the mansion. For a moment, Madison felt as if William's eyes had lingered on her, but she dismissed the thought. She must have been imagining things. Later, while organizing William's office, Madison found herself surrounded by leather-bound books, bronze figurines, and meticulously stacked papers. The room smelled of polished wood and aged leather. She was dusting a side table when she heard footsteps approaching. William entered, his serious gaze landing directly on her. "You're new here?" he asked, his deep voice echoing through the room. Madison froze for a moment, feeling her heart race. "Yes, sir. I started 2 days ago." William nodded absent-mindedly, his eyes scanning her from head to toe as though trying to decipher her. Then his eyes stopped on the heart-shaped pendant she wore. Time seemed to freeze. "That necklace," William murmured, his voice distant, almost a whisper. He stepped forward, his eyes wide and fixed on the piece hanging around her neck. "Where did you get that?" Madison looked at him, surprised by the sudden question and the expression on William's face, which seemed frozen in time. "This necklace, it's mine. I've always had it," she replied softly, touching the piece with her fingers. "They told me at the orphanage that I was found with it when I was a baby, sir." William didn't respond immediately. The color drained from his face, and he seemed to struggle to breathe. Memories returned like a blow, flashes of his little daughter, smiling while holding the same necklace. William's heart pounded erratically, and an old sensation, the pain of an irreparable loss, flooded back over him. "You," he started, but his voice faltered. William ran a hand over his face, trying to compose himself. "You may go." Madison hesitated, concerned by his reaction, but obeyed and quickly left the office. As she shut the door behind her, she could still hear William sinking into his chair, his breathing labored. Joseph appeared in the hallway, as though he had been waiting for her. His gaze was cold and calculating. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice low but heavy with accusation. "Nothing, I was just cleaning," Madison replied, feeling the weight of the entire situation bearing down on her. "Stay away from Mr. William and put that necklace away. I don't want to see it again," Joseph said, stepping closer. "Understood?" Madison nodded, swallowing hard. Joseph stood there for a moment, as if trying to intimidate her further, before turning and disappearing into the dark hallway. Madison returned to her room, trembling. She closed the door and sat on the bed, bringing her hands up to the necklace. Why was Mr. William so disturbed by this? Why does Joseph want me to hide this piece so badly? She wondered silently. At that moment, she knew something was deeply wrong in that house. William's reaction, the necklace, and Joseph's growing hostility, everything seemed intertwined in a mystery she still couldn't grasp the gravity of. Outside, William remained in his office, staring at an old photograph. It was an image of his young daughter, wearing the same necklace he had just seen on Madison. "It can't be," he murmured, his eyes filled with anguish. And in that moment, he decided he needed to know the truth. The Harris mansion sank into a tense silence that night. Madison had barely slept. Images of her encounter with William, his disturbed expression, and Joseph's insistence that she hide the necklace hammered through her mind. Something was happening, something she couldn't understand but felt deep in her chest. In his office, William remained awake, Scattered across his desk were old photographs of his missing daughter. She had been only 2 years old the last time he saw her. Her sweet smile and dark curls were details he had never forgotten. In the photo, the heart-shaped necklace was the same as the one now hanging around Madison's neck. He closed his eyes, running his hands over his face. The memories attacked him violently. The day the little girl vanished, Catherine's screams, the desperate search through the house, the endless days without news, and then the silence. "Could it really be you?" he murmured to himself. William was not a man who believed in coincidences. The necklace was a clue, but he needed proof. He needed to know who Madison was and what she meant. With a swift motion, he grabbed the phone and made a call. "Thomas, I need your services. Come to the mansion tomorrow." The next morning, Madison was determined to stay out of trouble. Joseph had sent her to clean the second floor, but she could feel the butler's eyes on her at all times, as though waiting for her to make a mistake. The atmosphere in the mansion felt heavier than it had in the past few days. While cleaning the hallway, her eyes were drawn to a slightly ajar door. She hesitated, remembering Joseph's orders to stay away from places where she wasn't needed, but curiosity got the better of her. The room was small, unlike the mansion's grand spaces, almost as if it had been forgotten. Inside, there was an old piece of furniture, a worn wooden trunk, and a shelf filled with aged books. Madison entered slowly, her steps light, as though she feared waking something sleeping there. As she approached the shelf, she noticed a fallen picture frame hidden behind a dusty book. She picked up the photograph carefully. Her eyes widened. It was the same little girl from the painting on the third floor, the same girl with the identical necklace to hers. Madison raised a hand to her chest, feeling a wave of emotion and confusion. That child. Was it her? The face looked familiar, but her memories were a complete blank before the age of 2. "What are you doing here?" Joseph's voice exploded like thunder behind her. Madison jumped, dropping the photograph to the floor. She spun around, her face pale with fright, as Joseph approached with heavy steps. His gaze was filled with fury. "I was just cleaning. I didn't know this room was off limits," she stammered. Joseph bent down, picking up the photograph with an eerie calm. He looked at the image for a long moment before turning back to Madison, his face hardened and dark. "There are things in this house that do not concern you. This door must remain closed. Always." He stepped closer, his voice low and threatening. "And I'll warn you one last time, put that necklace away." Madison swallowed hard, unable to respond. Joseph left the room and shut the door behind him, leaving her alone and trembling. She looked once more at the necklace around her neck, feeling its weight heavier than ever. Meanwhile, William received Thomas, the private detective, in his office. "I need you to investigate a girl named Madison," William said, handing the detective the few details he had. "She works here at the mansion. I want to know everything about her past, where she grew up, who her parents are, where she was 17 years ago." Thomas nodded, efficiently jotting down the information. "Did something happen with her, Mr. William?" the detective asked, curious. William hesitated for a moment before answering. "It may just be a coincidence, but I need to be sure." "Don't worry, I'll bring you answers soon," Thomas promised, leaving the office. William was alone once more, staring out the window at the mansion's gardens. Outside, he spotted Madison tending to the plants, focused on her work. The sun glinted off her dark hair, and for a moment William saw the ghost of his little daughter. He closed his eyes, feeling his heart grow heavy. "If it's you, I promise I'll never let you go again." That night, while the mansion slept, Madison couldn't keep her thoughts from wandering. She clutched the necklace while staring at the dark ceiling, the photograph of the little girl still vivid in her mind. Who was that child? Why did Joseph seem so threatening when the subject arose? For the first time in years, she began to question her past. Who were her parents? Why had they abandoned her in the park? And what did this necklace truly mean? She closed her eyes, trying in vain to find answers in memories that didn't exist. On the other side of the house, Joseph walked silently through the dark hallway, his shoes making a soft, rhythmic sound. He stopped once again in front of Madison's room, as though her presence disturbed him. His face, illuminated only by the faint light from the windows, looked shadowed and troubled. "This shouldn't be happening," he murmured to himself. That night, as Madison slept fitfully and William relived old memories, Joseph knew that time was running out. The past, which he had spent years burying, was about to rise to the surface, and he would do anything to keep the truth from coming to light. The days that followed at the Harris mansion became an almost suffocating routine for Madison. Joseph was stricter than ever, watching her every step like a vigilant guard. The butler's heavy gaze seemed to constantly remind her that she didn't belong in this place. But something had shifted. Discovering that photograph and the encounter with William had planted seeds of unease within Madison. For the first time in years, she began to wonder who she really was. Meanwhile, Thomas, the detective hired by William, worked quietly. His contacts led him to old documents and orphanage records, where he searched for any clues about Madison. Her past, as far as he knew, began in the park where she had been found, a 2-year-old girl holding nothing but a necklace. At the mansion, William couldn't get Madison out of his mind. He kept his distance, observing her from afar during the moments she crossed the hallways or tended to the garden. Each time he saw the necklace around her neck, his chest tightened as though time had leapt back 17 years. That morning, during breakfast, Joseph informed William of the day's schedule, as he always did. Madison entered the dining room to serve coffee, and William seized the chance to observe her more closely. "Madison," he called, addressing her for the first time in Joseph's presence. She froze, nearly spilling the coffee pot. Surprised, she looked at him. "Yes, sir?" William seemed to hesitate, but then pointed to the necklace. "That necklace, is it important to you?" Madison glanced at Joseph for a moment before answering, as though seeking permission. The butler kept his cold expression, but his eyes screamed a silent warning. "It's the only thing I have from my past, sir. I was found with it as a baby," she replied softly but firmly. William nodded slowly, as though he had expected that answer. Behind him, Joseph clenched his fists, though his calm facade remained intact. "Very well," William said, turning his attention back to Joseph. "I need to go out this afternoon. Make sure everything is in order." Joseph bowed slightly. "As you wish, Mr. William." Madison left the room quickly, feeling Joseph's gaze burn into her back. Something was happening, and she knew the necklace was at the center of it. Later, while tending to the 3rd floor, Madison was startled by a familiar voice. "Miss, could you help me?" She turned and saw a tall, middle-aged man in the hallway. It was Thomas, the private detective, though she didn't know that. He smiled kindly. "Sorry, I'm a bit lost. I came here on business with Mr. William, but this house is enormous," he explained with a forced laugh. "Oh, of course. Mr. William's office is on the 1st floor to the right," Madison replied politely, pointing the way. "Thank you very much," he said, before looking at her more closely. His eyes landed on the necklace. "That necklace is very beautiful. Is it a family piece?" Madison was caught off guard by the question. I don't know. It's all I have from my parents," she replied. Thomas nodded, as though that information was far more significant than it seemed. "It's a unique piece. Hard to find something like that around," he commented, before bidding her farewell. Madison continued her work, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave her. Somehow the mansion seemed to have eyes and ears hidden in every corner. That night, William received Thomas in his office. "Well, did you find anything?" William asked, anxious. Thomas placed a folder on the table. "I'm still in the early stages, Mr. William, but I've found some information. Madison was discovered in a park 17 years ago, without any documents, holding only that necklace. She was taken to an orphanage, and from there no one knows anything more about her parents or what happened before." William ran his hands over his face, frustrated. "It's her, Thomas. I feel it's her. That necklace cannot be a coincidence." "I agree it's strange, Mr. William, but we don't yet have definitive proof. I'll keep investigating. I can try to locate hospital records or reports of disappearances from that time." William nodded. "Do whatever it takes. If she's my daughter, I need to know." Meanwhile, Joseph wandered through the mansion's hallways like a ghost. He knew that something was about to unravel. Thomas, the detective, was a threat, as was Madison. Her return had awakened a past he had spent years burying, and he wouldn't allow it to come to light so easily. He stopped in front of Madison's door, his hands trembling as they hovered over the doorknob. He didn't enter. Instead, he whispered to himself, almost like a warning, "She cannot stay here." Inside, Madison was awake, clutching the necklace to her chest. She knew something was about to happen. The necklace, the mansion, Joseph, William. Everything was connected. But how? Morning at the Harris mansion began like any other, silent, meticulously organized, with Joseph issuing orders like a general on a battlefield. Madison, however, felt a growing unease. The events of the previous day, the photograph in the forbidden room, and Joseph's expression still haunted her thoughts. She knew she needed to be careful, but the questions that tormented her were stronger than her fear. Meanwhile, far from the mansion, Thomas, the private detective, had begun his work. The information provided by William was sparse. Madison's name, her approximate age, and the crucial detail, the heart-shaped necklace. Thomas was experienced and knew that small clues could unravel great mysteries. His first stop was the orphanage where Madison had grown up. "Madison, yes, I remember her," said the director, a kind-eyed woman with grey hair. "She arrived here when she was only 2 years old, a quiet and very sweet girl." Thomas jotted everything down as the director continued. "She was found abandoned in a park, with no documents or information about her parents. The only thing she had with her was a heart-shaped necklace. It was all she had." "The necklace was given back to her when she was older?" Thomas asked, focused. "Yes. We kept it safe until she turned 16. It was her only connection to the past, so we felt it was only fair that she have it." The detective requested permission to look through the orphanage's records and old photographs. After some time, he found Madison's file, a black and white photo of a small child with dark, soft curls, the necklace clearly visible around her neck. He copied everything and left the orphanage, certain he was closing in on something significant. At the mansion, Madison kept busy with her tasks, trying to ignore Joseph's constant presence. That day he was harsher than usual, reprimanding her for even the smallest details. "The floor still has streaks," Joseph said, pointing to a part of the gleaming surface that Madison had just cleaned. "Do it again, and this time do it right." Madison took a deep breath, holding back tears. There was something almost cruel in Joseph's eyes, as though he was trying to break her. She obeyed, starting the task over. As she scrubbed the floor, she heard footsteps coming down the hall. She looked up and saw William standing there, watching her in silence. His gaze wasn't one of disapproval, but something more complex, a mix of curiosity, melancholy, and doubt. "Joseph, let her work," William said, his voice deep but firm. Joseph turned immediately, masking his irritation with a neutral expression. "Of course, sir." He cast one last cold look at Madison before walking away. William approached slowly, his hands tucked into the pockets of his well-tailored suit. "Are you settling in well?" he asked, his voice softer now. Madison nodded, avoiding direct eye contact. "Yes, sir. I just want to do a good job." William was silent for a moment, his eyes once again landing on the necklace she wore. "That necklace? It means a lot to you?" She touched the piece delicately, feeling the cold metal between her fingers. "It's all I have from my past. I've always wondered where it came from or who gave it to me, but I've never found answers." William seemed to struggle with something inside himself, as though he wanted to say something important but couldn't. Finally, he just nodded. "Keep it safe. Sometimes objects like that carry more stories than we imagine." Madison looked up, surprised by the gentleness in his tone, but William had already turned and disappeared down the hallway. That evening, Thomas called William with his initial findings. "Mr. Harris, I visited the orphanage where Madison grew up. She was found abandoned in a park at 2 years old. The necklace was the only thing she had with her." William's heart clenched. "A park?" he murmured. "That's where my daughter used to play." "The description of the necklace matches exactly what you told me," Thomas continued. "The girl in the orphanage photo looks very much like the old images you gave me. I can't confirm anything yet, but it's too big a coincidence to ignore." William took a deep breath, feeling hope and fear mix within him. "Keep digging. I need to know the truth." "Leave it to me. I'll have more answers soon." William hung up and sat alone in his office, staring once again at the photograph of his missing daughter. "If she really is my daughter, I will protect her this time," he promised himself. On the other side of the mansion, Joseph watched Madison from the top of the staircase. His eyes were dark, filled with unease. He knew William was investigating, and he knew the secrets of the past were close to being exposed. "This cannot happen," he whispered to himself. Joseph descended the stairs slowly, the shadows of night swallowing him. He knew he had to act quickly. If William discovered the truth, everything he had built would come crashing down, and he wouldn't let that happen. That morning, a thick mist covered the gardens of the Harris mansion, giving the place an even more somber appearance. Madison felt the oppressive atmosphere as she prepared for her daily tasks. Joseph, as always, seemed to appear out of nowhere, silently watching her with that heavy, critical gaze that made her feel increasingly uncomfortable. Madison couldn't forget the last few days. William's unsettled look when he saw her necklace, the forbidden room, and especially Joseph's growing hostility. Something in this house didn't make sense. The feeling that she was at the center of something much bigger tormented her more each day. As she finished arranging the main hall, she heard the sound of firm footsteps approaching. When she looked up, she saw William standing in the doorway, his expression serious and distant. "Madison," he called, his voice deep but without Joseph's sharpness. She placed the last silver piece on the tray and turned to face him. "Yes, sir? I need to speak with you in the office. Come." Madison's heart raced. William never called for her directly. She glanced around as though looking for support, but she was alone. Feeling the weight of every step, she followed William to the office. When she entered, William closed the door behind them. The room felt stifling, filled with old books and memories of the past. On the desk, Madison saw a familiar photograph, the image of a child with curly hair and a necklace identical to hers. "Sit," William instructed, pointing to the chair in front of him. She obeyed, her hands trembling in her lap. William took a deep breath before speaking. "Tell me everything you know about the necklace you're wearing." Madison was surprised by the directness of his question. I don't know much, sir. At the orphanage, they told me I was found with it as a baby. I never knew my parents or where I came from. The necklace is all I have from my past." William studied her in silence, as if analyzing every word, every movement she made. After a few seconds, he picked up the photograph from the desk and handed it to Madison. "Do you recognize this girl?" She looked at the image, her heart nearly stopped. The child in the photo could have been her, the hair, the eyes, the necklace. Everything was identical. It looks like me," she whispered, unable to hide her shock. "But where did this photo come from?" William clasped his hands together on the desk, his voice heavy with restrained emotion. "That girl is my daughter. She disappeared 17 years ago. And the necklace you wear, it's the same one she had." Madison felt the world spin around her. "Your daughter?" she murmured, stunned. "How is that possible?" "That's exactly what I want to find out," William said, looking deeply into her eyes. "I hired a detective to investigate your past. He discovered that you were found abandoned in a park, the same park where my daughter used to play before she disappeared." Madison was speechless. Her mind spun with the information, trying to connect the pieces. Suddenly, everything seemed to make sense and at the same time impossible to believe. "So, you think I'm your daughter?" she asked, her voice nearly trembling. William nodded slowly. "I don't know for sure yet, but the coincidences are far too great to ignore. I want you to do a DNA test with me. Only then will we know the truth." Madison leaned back in the chair, feeling a heavy weight in her chest. The possibility of finally discovering the truth about her past scared her, and at the same time awakened something she had never felt before. Hope. I don't know what to say," she whispered. William stood and approached her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I know it's a lot to take in, but Madison, if there's even a chance you're my daughter, I need to know. I can't lose this opportunity." Madison nodded slowly, feeling tears burn in her eyes. "All right, I'll do the test." Outside the office, Joseph stood hidden in the dark hallway, listening to every word. His expression was one of pure panic. "This cannot happen, not now," he murmured, his hands trembling slightly. He knew that the DNA test would mean the end of everything. The secret he had kept buried for so many years was about to come to light, and that could mean only one thing: his fate was sealed. He hurried down the stairs, muttering to himself, his face twisted in an expression of desperation. Joseph knew he had to act. Madison was a threat, and he wouldn't allow the truth to surface. "She cannot stay here," he hissed to himself, disappearing into the mansion's shadows. That night, Madison lay in bed, her thoughts swirling like a storm. The idea that William could be her father was both terrifying and comforting. For the first time, she felt there might be a chance to finally belong somewhere. But deep down, something unsettled her. Joseph's behavior, the mansion's heavy atmosphere, everything pointed to a dark secret she still couldn't grasp. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and the shadows seemed darker than usual. In the hallway, Joseph paused once again outside Madison's door. He stood there for long minutes, unmoving, listening to the heavy silence from the other side. "You never should have come here," he whispered, almost like a promise. That night, as Madison slept, the danger she didn't yet know was closer than ever. That morning, heavy clouds covered the sky, as though nature itself sensed that something important was about to happen. Madison, her nerves on edge, began her usual tasks, but nothing felt normal. Her mind spun with William's words from the night before. The idea that he might be her father left her restless, torn between hope and the fear of disappointment. While she tried to keep herself busy in the mansion's east wing, Joseph appeared suddenly, like a shadow emerging from the darkness. His face was pale, his eyes unusually hard. "Mr. William has asked to see you in the office again," he said, his voice low and cutting. Madison felt her stomach drop. The mere mention of William's name brought back all the tension from the previous night. She nodded silently and made her way down the long corridor, feeling Joseph's gaze following her until she turned the corner. When she reached the office, William was already waiting. He stood by the window, looking out over the gardens with a distant expression. When he heard the door close, he turned slowly. "Sit down, Madison," he said, his voice deep but calm. She obeyed, sitting in the same chair as the day before. William approached and sat across from her, his hands clasped on the desk. His eyes, intense and searching, settled directly on hers. "I spoke with Detective Thomas," William began, without preamble. "He confirmed what I already suspected. You were found in a park when you were only 2 years old, the same park where my daughter used to play before she disappeared." Madison nodded slowly, feeling her heartbeat quicken. "That means you think I'm—" "My daughter," William finished, his voice firm but full of emotion. "And that's why I need us to do a DNA test. It's the only way to be sure." Madison lowered her eyes to the necklace around her neck. The piece, which for so long had been her only connection to the past, now seemed like the key to a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. "I agree," she finally replied. William let out a quiet sigh, as though part of his burden had been lifted. "We're going to the lab today. Joseph will accompany us." At the mention of the butler's name, Madison couldn't suppress the shiver that ran down her spine. Joseph. Something about him wasn't right, and she could feel it in every fiber of her being. A few hours later, William, Madison, and Joseph were in the car heading to the lab. William kept his eyes fixed on the road, while Joseph sat silently in the front seat, his hands tightly clasped on his lap. He seemed rigid, as though he was about to snap. Madison stared out the window, trying to ignore the tension hanging in the air. Through the rearview mirror, she could see Joseph casting furtive glances at her, which only deepened her discomfort. "We're almost there," William said, breaking the silence. No one responded. When the car finally stopped in front of the lab, Joseph stepped out quickly and opened the door for William. But his look at Madison was sharper than ever. A chill ran through her. "I'll wait out here," Joseph said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. William nodded as though he didn't notice the butler's odd behavior and led Madison inside. The process was quick, but every second felt like an eternity. Madison felt a slight prick as blood was drawn, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the storm of emotions raging inside her. When they left the lab, William placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "In a few days, we'll have the answers we need. Until then, I want you to feel safe here at the mansion." Madison nodded, though a shadow of doubt lingered in her heart. Something about Joseph, his presence, his stare, told her she wasn't safe. Not while he was around. Back at the mansion, Joseph was waiting at the top of the staircase, as though he'd stood there the entire time. When he saw William and Madison enter, his eyes darkened even more. "Joseph," William called, stopping in the middle of the hall, "I need you to oversee preparations for tomorrow's dinner. I'll be meeting with some important investors." "As you wish," Joseph replied with a slight bow. Madison hurried up to her room, feeling the butler's gaze burn into her back. As soon as she shut the door, she fell onto her bed, clutching the necklace to her chest. "What's happening?" she whispered to herself, feeling a tear slide down her face. Meanwhile, Joseph entered his private quarters, locking the door behind him. He paced back and forth, his face twisted with fury and desperation. "This test cannot happen, it can't be true," he muttered, as though trying to convince himself. Joseph opened a hidden drawer in his wardrobe and pulled out an old, yellowed envelope. Inside was a photograph, William's young daughter wearing the heart-shaped necklace around her neck. Beside her was a younger Joseph, his face tense and guilty. He crushed the photo in his hands, his eyes filled with rage. "She cannot take the place I've earned. Not now." Outside, the strong wind battered the mansion's windows, like a warning that the truth was about to emerge. And when it did, nothing would ever be the same. The Harris mansion awoke under a grey, heavy sky, as though even the weather knew that an ancient secret was about to emerge. Madison rose early, but the weight of exhaustion hung over her shoulders like a stone. The hours at the lab still echoed in her mind, and the idea that William might be her father kept her awake. As she made her bed, the sound of firm knocks on the door startled her. For a second, she thought it might be Joseph. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door. To her surprise, William stood there, his expression softer than usual. "Good morning, Madison. May I come in?" "Of course, sir," she replied, stepping aside to let him pass. William entered and looked around. The room was small, almost austere, but impeccably organized. His gaze settled on Madison, more serious now. "The test results should arrive tomorrow," he said, getting straight to the point. "I know this is a lot for you, but I want you to know that regardless of what the results reveal, you will be treated with respect in this house." Madison felt a tightness in her chest, surprised by his kindness. For a moment, she almost forgot Joseph's hostility and the mansion's oppressive weight. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot to me." William nodded, offering a faint smile. "You don't have to call me sir. You can call me William." Madison smiled shyly. When William left, she sat on the bed, clutching the necklace between her fingers. For the first time, the idea of having a real family began to seem possible. Meanwhile, Joseph descended the stairs toward William's office, his expression dark and his footsteps echoing over the cold marble floor. He stopped at the door, took a deep breath, and knocked. "Come in," William's firm voice responded. Joseph entered to find William standing by the window, as though the master of the house already knew the reason for his visit. "Is there something you wish to say, Joseph?" William asked without turning around. "Sir, Joseph hesitated, carefully choosing his words. "I don't believe that girl deserves your trust. She's a stranger. We don't know her intentions." William finally turned, his eyes narrowed in disapproval. "That girl might be my daughter," he replied firmly, "and you, Joseph, are overstepping your bounds." "Forgive me, sir, but what if she's lying?" William stepped closer, his voice low but filled with authority. "That's enough, Joseph. The test results will arrive tomorrow. The truth will come out, and I want you to treat Madison with respect until then. Understood?" Joseph clenched his fists but lowered his head in submission. "Yes, sir." As he left the office, however, the butler was far from defeated. His eyes burned with contained fury, and his mind swirled with plans. He knew that if the truth were revealed, his entire world would collapse. He couldn't let that happen. "The truth will never leave this house," he muttered to himself as he walked through the empty hallways. That afternoon, Madison was organizing the library when she stumbled upon a small wooden box hidden among the books. Curiosity got the better of her. She carefully opened the lid and discovered a series of old, yellowed photographs. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw the image of a child with curly hair and a sweet smile, the same girl from the paintings and photographs she had seen before. And beside her was a young man whom Madison recognized immediately. Joseph. "What is this?" she murmured, her fingers trembling. Before she could look further, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the library. She quickly closed the box and returned it to its place, turning just as Joseph appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice sharper than ever. I'm cleaning," Madison replied, trying to sound calm. Joseph stepped toward her, his eyes narrowed. For a moment, it seemed like he could read her thoughts. "Don't touch what doesn't belong to you," he said, each word heavy with menace. "I didn't do anything," Madison shot back, anger rising to replace her fear. Joseph moved closer, leaning down until their faces were inches apart. "You don't belong here," he hissed. "You'd better leave before it's too late." Madison felt a chill run through her body but didn't look away. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly, surprising even herself. Joseph froze for a moment, as though he hadn't expected that response. Then, he turned abruptly and stormed out of the library, slamming the door behind him. Madison remained there, breathing heavily, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew Joseph was hiding something, and now she was certain he would do anything to protect his secret. That night, as the mansion settled into silence, Joseph locked himself in his private quarters. He stared at an old photograph he held in his trembling hands, the same one Madison had found in the library. "Everything I did was to protect what was mine," he murmured, his voice shaking. On the other side of the house, Madison sat awake in her bed, clutching the necklace. She knew something was about to happen, something that would change her life forever. "Tomorrow, the truth will come," she whispered to herself, staring into the darkness of her room. Little did she know that while she awaited the test results, Joseph was already planning his next and most dangerous move yet. The Harris mansion awoke under a sky heavy with clouds, as though the house itself knew an ancient secret was about to emerge. Madison woke with her heart racing, as if she could sense that this would be the day that changed her life forever. As she opened her bedroom door, she found Joseph standing in the hallway like a statue. His cold, vacant eyes settled on her with an intensity that made her shiver. "Mr. William is waiting for you in the office," he said, his voice low but laced with something almost threatening. "Thank you," Madison replied, trying to stay calm as she walked past him. Joseph's gaze followed her until she disappeared down the corridor. When she reached the office, William was already there, standing with a serious and distant expression. On the desk was a sealed envelope. Her stomach dropped. That envelope contained the answers they both had been waiting for, answers about who she truly was. "Sit down, Madison," William said, gesturing to the chair. She obeyed, feeling her hands sweat as he picked up the envelope. William was silent for a moment, as though gathering the strength to open that fragile piece of paper. When he finally tore the seal and pulled out the results, his face became completely unreadable. Madison felt time freeze. "What does it say, sir?" Her voice came out trembling, almost a whisper. William took a deep breath and looked straight at her. His eyes were glossy, and his voice was heavy with emotion. "You are my daughter, Madison. The DNA test confirmed it." Madison froze. William's words echoed in her mind, but they felt distant, as though drifting through a haze. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. "My daughter," William repeated, this time with more softness, as if trying to convince himself of the truth. He stepped around the desk and knelt before her, taking her hands firmly in his own. "I searched for you all these years. I never gave up hope that I would find you one day." Tears began streaming down Madison's face. A mixture of relief, joy, and disbelief overwhelmed her. Everything she had ever wished for, a family, a place to belong, was now right in front of her. I can't believe it," she whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. William smiled, his own eyes glistening with emotion. "It's real, my daughter. You're home now." He embraced her tightly, and Madison let herself sink into that moment, a gesture that finally filled the emptiness she had carried her entire life. For the first time, she felt protected, loved, complete. Outside the office, Joseph stood in the hallway listening to every word. His eyes were wide, his face pale as wax. The worst had happened. The truth had been revealed. "No, it can't be," he muttered, stepping back as though the ground beneath him had crumbled. He knew his secret was lost. Madison, the one he had tried so hard to keep away, now held the place he had feared for so long. Joseph rushed down to his quarters, locking himself in his room. There he opened the drawer where he kept the old photograph of William's daughter. His fingers trembled as he touched the faded paper. "I did everything for you," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the image. "Everything I did was to protect this house, to protect myself." William's voice echoed in his mind, relentless. "You are my daughter, Madison." "I won't let this happen," Joseph murmured darkly, his face twisting into a grim expression. "She can't take everything from me." Later that afternoon, Madison was led to the main hall where Catherine, William's wife, was waiting. The woman who had always seemed distant and silent now looked at Madison with tears in her eyes. "William told me everything," Catherine said, stepping forward cautiously. You are our daughter." Madison barely had time to react before Catherine pulled her into a tight embrace. "My girl, I thought I would never see you again," Catherine sobbed, stroking Madison's hair. The warmth of that embrace brought even more tears to Madison's eyes. It was a new feeling, something she had never known before, the love of a mother. William watched the scene closely, his heart full of emotion. The Harris mansion, which once felt cold and empty, now seemed more alive than ever. "From today on, everything will be different," William said firmly. "Madison, this is your home. It always will be." Madison smiled through her tears, finally feeling as though she had found her place in the world. That night, as the mansion quietly celebrated the family's reunion, Joseph sat alone in his room, surrounded by shadows. His eyes stared blankly into the distance while his mind worked furiously, crafting a plan. "I won't let this happen," he whispered, his voice laced with cold rage. The past he had fought so hard to bury was now teetering on the edge of exposure, and Joseph knew he had little time left to stop everything from falling apart. In the hallway, the wind howled through the windows, a dark whisper of something inevitable. The truth had been revealed, but danger still lurked, hidden within the shadows of the Harris mansion. Dawn arrived in silence, but the tension hanging over the Harris mansion was palpable. For Madison, every minute felt like an eternity. The certainty that the test results would arrive that morning brought a mix of anxiety and fear. She tried to keep herself busy, but her hands trembled with every movement. William, meanwhile, sat in his office staring at the door, waiting for news. Thomas, the private detective, had promised to deliver the results personally, and William knew that in just a few hours the truth would finally be revealed. Meanwhile, Joseph prowled through the hallways like a shadow, muttering to himself. His face was pale, his eyes sunken and dark, like those of a man teetering on the edge of despair. He knew that this morning could be the end of everything, and he wasn't about to let that happen. "No, this won't happen," he whispered, wiping a trembling hand over his sweaty face. Around 10 o'clock, the sound of a car echoed through the courtyard. Madison was in the kitchen when she saw through the window Thomas stepping out of the vehicle, a black folder under his arm. Her breath caught in her throat. "It's today," she murmured to herself, her heart pounding far too hard. Joseph also saw Thomas arrive and clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. He knew he couldn't stop the detective from entering, but he still had a plan, a last resort to prevent the truth from surfacing. In the office, William greeted Thomas with a firm handshake, though his expression betrayed his quiet nervousness. "You have the results?" William asked, cutting straight to the point. "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, placing the folder on the desk. "The lab has confirmed the tests." William stared at the folder as though it weighed 1,000 pounds. For a moment, he hesitated, afraid the answers might not be what he hoped for. Taking a deep breath, he opened the folder and scanned the document quickly. Then he stopped, his heart nearly burst. "Positive," he murmured, his voice shaking. Thomas nodded, confirming. "Madison is your daughter, Mr. Harris." William ran a hand over his eyes, unable to hold back the tears. 17 years of searching, of pain, of emptiness. And now, at last, she was here. He remained silent for a moment, letting himself feel the tidal wave of emotions that hit him. "Thank you, Thomas," William said, his voice thick with emotion. "More than I can express. If you need anything else, I'm at your disposal," Thomas replied before leaving William alone with the document that would change everything. William found Madison in the hallway on her way to the library. She stopped when she saw him, surprised by the look on his face, something between relief and emotion. "Madison," he called, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Sir," she replied, feeling her stomach drop. William approached slowly, holding the folder in his hands. He stopped in front of her, looking deeply into her eyes. "The test came back positive." Madison's eyes widened, unable to speak. The world around her seemed to spin slowly. "What? You're my daughter, Madison," William continued, smiling through his emotion. "You're the little girl who disappeared 17 years ago." Tears began streaming down Madison's face before she could stop them. She clutched the necklace around her neck, feeling the weight of the truth finally come to light. I'm your daughter," she whispered, still unable to believe it. William nodded, and then in a hesitant gesture opened his arms. Madison didn't resist. She moved forward, embracing him tightly, feeling the warmth of a fatherly hug she never imagined she would have. "I searched for you all these years," William whispered, his voice breaking. "I never lost hope. And I always wondered who my parents were," Madison replied, sobbing with emotion. As the two embraced in the hallway bathed in morning sunlight, Joseph watched from afar, hidden in the shadow of a column. His face was twisted into a mix of rage, envy, and despair. "No!" he hissed, barely audible. "This can't be happening." Later that day, William called Catherine, his wife, to share the news. She entered the office without knowing what to expect, but froze when she saw Madison standing beside her husband. "William, what's going on?" William smiled at her, his eyes shining. "Catherine, I want you to meet our daughter, Madison." Catherine covered her mouth with her hands, tears immediately welling in her eyes. She stepped forward slowly, staring at Madison as though she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "My daughter," Catherine whispered, before pulling Madison into an emotional embrace. Madison cried again, feeling one for the first time truly at home. That embrace was unlike any she had ever experienced. It was an embrace of belonging, of true love. While the family celebrated, Joseph locked himself in his quarters, muttering incomprehensible words. He knew the walls were closing in. The truth had been revealed, and now it was only a matter of time before his actions from 17 years ago came to light. He opened a drawer and pulled out an old diary where he had recorded everything that had happened all those years ago. "I won't let this destroy me," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the pages. "Not now." Outside, the mansion's hallways felt more alive than ever. The house, which had held secrets and pain for so long, was now beginning to fill with love and the hope of a new beginning. But Joseph knew the newfound peace was fragile, and he was willing to do anything to protect what he believed was his. Dawn broke with a heavy sky, as though the weighted clouds were a warning that this day would bring inescapable revelations. Madison woke early, but she felt no usual exhaustion. Anxiety coursed through every fiber of her body. She knew the DNA test results would arrive that morning, and with them, the truth would finally come to light. As she descended the stairs, the mansion's silence felt heavier than ever. The expressions of the staff were tense, as though they too could sense that something monumental was about to happen. Joseph moved stiffly through the corridors, his eyes shadowed and sunken, like a man cornered with nowhere to run. Madison found William in the main hall. He stood by the window looking out at the gardens, but when he saw her approaching, he offered a faint smile, a gesture of comfort amid the storm they both faced. "Are you ready?" William asked, his voice firm yet kind. Madison nodded, though her hands trembled. "I am." "Come to the office. The results arrived just a few minutes ago." William turned and led Madison to the room where everything would be decided. Entering the office, Madison's eyes fell on a white envelope resting on the mahogany desk. She swallowed hard. That small object held the answers to questions that had followed her throughout her life. William approached the desk and for a moment hesitated, taking a deep breath before picking up the envelope. "Before I open this," he began, looking directly at Madison, "I want you to know that regardless of the result, you will always have a place in this house." She nodded, tears threatening to spill. William carefully opened the envelope. That minute stretched into what felt like hours, every second a deafening drumbeat in Madison's chest. William read the document silently, his eyes slowly scanning the lines as though he needed to absorb each word. Then he looked up. His face was pale, his eyes bright with emotion. "It's true," he whispered, his voice choked. "Madison, you are my daughter." The world around her seemed to freeze. Those words echoed in Madison's mind like thunder. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she even realized she was crying. "Your daughter," she repeated softly, as though she needed to say it aloud to believe it. William stepped around the desk and knelt in front of her, gently taking her trembling hands in his. "For all these years, I never lost hope of finding you. And now, here you are, my daughter." Madison sobbed, her heart overflowing with a mix of joy, relief, and sorrow. For so long she had believed she had no family, that she was just a lost girl in a vast, uncaring world. Now, she wasn't alone anymore. William pulled her into a tight embrace, as though shielding her from all the suffering she had endured. "You're home, Madison," he whispered. "I'll never let anything bad happen to you again." Outside the office, Joseph stood frozen in the hallway, his fists clenched at his sides. He had heard every word, and the confirmation hit him like a sledgehammer. The truth he had feared for so many years had finally emerged. He descended the stairs slowly, the weight of each step like a nail being driven into his coffin. William's and Madison's voices echoed in his mind like a sentence. "This can't continue," he murmured, almost as a vow to himself. The news spread quickly through the mansion. Catherine, William's wife, returned hurriedly from a trip as soon as she learned what had happened. Her reunion with Madison was filled with tears and emotional embraces. Catherine, her eyes glistening, took the young woman's hands tenderly. "You are everything I dreamed of finding again. We lost so many years, but now we'll make up for them." Madison felt more welcomed than ever. For the first time, the mansion, which had once felt like a prison, now began to feel like a home. But while the family celebrated their reunion, Joseph watched from a distance, shadows concealing the disturbed expression on his face. He knew his time was running out. William trusted Madison completely, and if she stayed much longer, the secrets Joseph had buried would inevitably come to light. "They can't find out," he muttered to himself, walking quickly toward his quarters. Inside his room, he opened the hidden drawer where he kept his most damning secrets. Photographs, newspaper clippings, and a worn child's bracelet revealed the dark truth he had fought to conceal. Joseph stared at it all, closing his eyes as he relived the moment that had changed his life forever. The day he kidnapped Madison, driven by envy and fear of losing his place in the household. "I did what I had to do," he whispered, as though trying to convince himself. Hearing laughter echo down the corridor, Joseph clenched his fists. He would not allow Madison to remain, not now. Not after everything he had done to secure his position in the Harris mansion. As night fell and the mansion sank into quiet, Joseph sat cloaked in darkness, a plan already forming in his mind. Across the house, Madison lay in bed, her heart finally light with relief. For the first time, she fell asleep with a smile on her face, unaware that danger still lurked close, invisible, but deadly. The rising sun bathed the Harris mansion in a soft golden light, but the atmosphere inside the house was heavy with emotions. The revelation of the DNA test had brought a wave of happiness, surprise, and even disbelief. For Madison, it felt as though life had taken an unexpected turn, pulling her out of a silent void and placing her at the center of a family she had never dreamed of having. That morning, Catherine, William's wife, returned to the mansion after a brief trip to visit her family. William waited for her in the main hall, anxious to share the news. When she entered through the door, her usual elegance and grace intact, William approached with a warm smile, though tears threatened to surface in his eyes. "Catherine, come with me. There's something you need to see, or rather, someone," he said, taking her hands gently. She frowned, confusion clouding her face. "William, what is going on? Just trust me." He led her to the sitting room, where Madison was seated near a window, clutching the heart-shaped necklace. Her chest rose and fell quickly, nerves threatening to overwhelm her. When she saw Catherine enter, she froze, unsure of what to say or how to act. Catherine looked at the young woman for a moment, her dark eyes narrowing in a mix of confusion and recognition. Then she saw the necklace around Madison's neck. She gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "It can't be," she murmured, her voice trembling. William offered a small, reassuring smile, though his own emotions were barely under control. "Catherine, this is Madison, our daughter." The silence that followed was almost palpable. Catherine took a few seconds to process his words, to allow the impossible to become real. Tears began to fill her eyes as she stepped slowly toward Madison. "My daughter," Catherine whispered, kneeling in front of her. "My little girl." Madison couldn't hold back her tears. Catherine pulled her into a tight embrace, sobbing softly, as though she could make up for all the lost years in that single gesture. Madison closed her eyes, letting the warmth of that embrace wash over her. For the first time, she felt like she belonged, like she was part of a family. "I dreamed of this moment every day since you disappeared," Catherine murmured, her fingers gently combing through Madison's hair as only a mother would. "You came back to us. I never imagined I had a family," Madison whispered, her voice trembling. "I spent my whole life thinking I was alone." Catherine cupped her face in both hands, smiling through her tears. "Never again, my love, never again." William watched the scene with misty eyes, feeling the weight of years of pain finally begin to lift. For him, this moment was more than a reunion. It was a promise of redemption, of love rebuilt. While the family celebrated their reunion, Joseph stalked through the mansion's corridors with firm steps and a dark expression. He knew everything was collapsing around him. Madison wasn't just reclaiming the place he had tried to erase. She was threatening to uncover what he feared most, his secret. He stopped outside William's office, listening to the soft voices and gentle laughter echoing from within. He clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. "She's ruining everything," he hissed to himself, as though the words were venom that needed to be spat out. Joseph knew he had to act quickly. Madison was being accepted as part of the family, and that meant sooner or later they would discover what he had done. Time was against him, and the solution seemed darker with every passing moment. If she's not here, the truth dies with her. That evening, the mansion was more alive than ever. William and Catherine arranged a private dinner to celebrate Madison's return. The young woman, though overwhelmed, couldn't deny the warmth and happiness surrounding her. William had invited only a few close friends of the family, all of whom looked at Madison with a mix of curiosity and surprise. Wearing a simple dress Catherine had given her, Madison looked almost like someone else. Her hair was loose, falling in soft waves over her shoulders, and her eyes, though shy, shone with a light they had never carried before. "You look beautiful, dear," Catherine said, smiling warmly. "Thank you," Madison murmured, blushing. As everyone laughed and toasted to the future, Joseph watched from afar, hidden in the shadows. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses felt like a taunt. It was as though he was being erased, his presence diminished by Madison's very existence. "I've been the most loyal to this family," he thought furiously, "and now she appears to take everything from me." That night, as the guests departed and William embraced Madison proudly, Joseph made a silent decision. His eyes, once merely cold, now burned with something darker, a determination to eliminate the threat Madison posed. "This must end," he muttered, disappearing into the mansion's darkness. In the room that was now hers, Madison sat on the bed, her fingers gently touching the heart-shaped necklace. She smiled, feeling for the first time that she might have truly found her place in the world. But outside that room, in the silent shadows of the hallways, danger crept closer, invisible yet inevitable. Joseph would not give up so easily, and Madison still had no idea that the worst was yet to come. The morning at the Harris mansion dawned heavy with tension. The sky remained grey, and a light drizzle fell over the gardens like a veil of sadness stretching across the day. Despite the emotional dinner the night before, Madison woke with a strange feeling in her chest. It was as if something was wrong, an invisible, oppressive presence she couldn't ignore. Descending the stairs toward the kitchen, Madison noticed Joseph standing in the middle of the main hall. He was still staring into nothing, his hands clasped behind his back. The butler looked different, darker, his shoulders tense as though he carried an invisible burden. When he noticed her presence, he turned slowly, his eyes fixed on her. "Good morning, Joseph," Madison said, trying to be polite despite the unease his presence always brought. "Good morning, Miss Madison," he replied, his tone strange, almost venomous. "I see you're getting more comfortable in this house." The insinuation didn't go unnoticed. Madison frowned but chose to ignore it. Joseph continued to watch her for a few moments before walking away, his slow steps disappearing into a dark corridor. During breakfast, William noticed the tense silence surrounding Madison. He set his coffee cup down and looked at her with concern. "Is something wrong, my daughter?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "No, Father, I'm just tired," Madison replied, forcing a smile. She was still adjusting to calling him father, but the words came a little easier each day. William sensed something was troubling her but decided not to press. Catherine entered the room shortly after, bringing with her the warmth of a bright smile. "Madison, dear, after breakfast, I'd like to show you some photo albums. There's so much about our family I want to share with you," she said, placing a gentle hand on Madison's shoulder. "I'd love that, Mrs. Catherine," Madison replied, feeling warmed by the woman's affection. As the family talked, Joseph stood at the kitchen door, watching with narrowed eyes. He observed their interactions with deep resentment, as though Madison's growing bond with the Harris family was a direct affront to him. Later, Madison and Catherine sat together in the sitting room, surrounded by old photo albums. Catherine flipped through the pages slowly, pointing out pictures of a younger William, the grandparents, and a small girl with dark curls, the same girl Madison had seen in paintings and photographs around the mansion. "This was you, wasn't it?" Madison asked, touching a photo of Catherine holding the child in her arms. "Yes. You were only a year old here," Catherine replied with a melancholic smile. "Always smiling, always curious." Madison felt a lump in her throat as she looked at the image. For the first time, she began to see her place in that past. Her heart ached for the years lost, but swelled with hope for the family she had finally rediscovered. "You know, dear, it feels like a miracle to have you back," Catherine continued, taking Madison's hands in hers. "But I can see it in your eyes, and something is worrying you." Madison hesitated but finally confided. "It's Joseph," she whispered. "He doesn't seem happy with me being here. Sometimes I feel like he hates me." Catherine's face darkened slightly, and she sighed. "Joseph is a loyal man, but he is complicated. He has worked with us for many years and has always seen himself as an essential part of this house. Perhaps he's just unsettled by all these changes." Madison wasn't convinced but nodded. Catherine, sensing her discomfort, turned the page of the album and continued talking about the family's history. Meanwhile, Joseph descended to the mansion's private quarters, where no one else ventured. He walked to an old desk and pulled a small weathered box from a drawer. Inside were relics of a past he had fought to keep hidden. A photo of Madison as a child, a newspaper clipping about her disappearance, and a crumpled note he had read over and over for years. "The truth always finds its way back." Joseph crushed the note in his hands, sweat beading on his forehead. "No, she cannot stay here," he muttered to himself. "This will end." In that moment, he silently began to formulate a plan. If Madison remained, the truth he had buried would resurface and destroy everything. Joseph couldn't let that happen. He would be loyal to the Harris family, even if it meant taking extreme measures. That night, as Madison prepared for bed, a chill ran down her spine. She carefully shut the door to her room, ensuring it was locked. The mansion, which had seemed alive and warm during the day, now took on a darker, more ominous appearance. Lying in bed, clutching the heart-shaped necklace between her fingers, she closed her eyes and tried to push away the feeling that someone was watching her. Outside the door, Joseph stood motionless in the dark corridor, like a shadow. His cold, empty gaze reflected only one thing: resolve. Tomorrow this will all be over, he whispered, his voice laced with something chilling and final. That night, as Madison slept, danger walked silently through the mansion's hallways, drawing ever closer. The next morning at the Harris mansion began with the sun timidly breaking through the thick gray clouds. For Madison, the day felt like an extended dream. Since the DNA revelation, she was slowly getting used to the idea of having a family. William and Catherine treated her with such genuine warmth that it was impossible not to feel embraced, though the nagging feeling of being an intruder still surfaced within her from time to time. The mansion, however, seemed to react differently to the weight of the truth. There was something in the hallways, a denser silence, a chill that seemed to seep from the walls. At the center of it all was Joseph. Madison found him early that morning in the dining room, where he was setting the table for breakfast. His face was as rigid as always, but something about his eyes unsettled her, a hollow emptiness, as though he were there only in body. "Good morning, Joseph," she said cautiously, trying to ease the tension. The butler slowly lifted his gaze, fixing her with a stare so cold that Madison regretted speaking at all. "I see you're growing comfortable in your new role," he replied, his voice low and cutting. Madison frowned, startled by his tone. Joseph had never been friendly, but this was something beyond his usual strictness. "I'm just trying to adapt," she replied, keeping her voice calm despite the discomfort. "Adapt?" Joseph let out a low, strange laugh, a sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "You don't understand, do you? People like you don't belong in places like this." "What do you mean by that?" Madison retorted, anger finally breaking through her fear. Joseph stared at her for long seconds, as though debating what to say. Finally, he turned back to the silverware, ignoring her entirely. "Forget it, girl, just don't meddle where you don't belong," he muttered, almost to himself. Madison left the room quickly, her heart pounding. Something was wrong. Joseph was different. His gaze, his words, it felt like more than mere hostility. It was as if he were hiding something dark, something ready to surface. Throughout the day, Madison tried to shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every hallway she crossed, every room she organized, she felt Joseph's eyes on her even when he wasn't there. The sensation was suffocating. "Joseph has been acting strange," Madison confided to Catherine as they arranged flowers for that night's dinner. Catherine looked at her with surprise. "Strange? What do you mean?" "Joseph has worked for William for years. He's practically part of this house." "I know, but there's something about him that scares me. He treats me like I'm an intruder. Sometimes he seems dangerous," Madison murmured, feeling the weight of her words. Catherine laughed softly, placing a gentle hand on Madison's. "Joseph is strict, dear, but he wouldn't hurt anyone. Perhaps he's just trying to adjust to all these changes. He's always been traditional." Madison nodded, but the unease didn't fade. She knew something deeper was happening. That evening, dinner passed in a cheerful, relaxed atmosphere. William was more animated than usual, sharing stories of the past and smiling proudly whenever he looked at Madison. Catherine, radiant with happiness, watched her family come together as though the void that had haunted her for years had finally been filled. As he served dinner, Joseph remained silent, moving like a shadow around the table. His movements were precise, but his expression was unsettling. Every now and then, his gaze landed on Madison with a mix of disdain and fear. Madison tried to ignore him, focusing instead on William and Catherine's conversation, but she felt Joseph's presence like a weight pressing on her shoulders. When everyone retired to their rooms, Joseph remained in the kitchen, staring out into the darkness beyond the window. The dim lights illuminated only part of his face, leaving the rest hidden in shadow. His expression was hard, his thoughts racing. "She won't destroy everything," he whispered, his fingers curling against the marble counter. Joseph turned abruptly and left the room, disappearing into the mansion's darkened corridors. Later that night, Madison woke with a start. A faint noise echoed through the hallway, soft, almost imperceptible footsteps. Sitting up in bed, she looked toward the door, her heart racing. The light from the hallway spilled through the gap beneath the door, casting dancing shadows on the floor. Hesitant, she stood and carefully opened the door. The corridor was empty, but something caught her eye, A door at the far end, one that was always locked, was slightly ajar. Madison felt an inexplicable urge to approach it. Her heart pounded as she ran her fingers over the cold wood of the door and pushed it open further. The room was dark, but a flickering candle illuminated its center. On a small table lay papers, old photographs, and an object that made her blood run cold. A necklace identical to hers, but broken. "What is this?" Madison whispered, horrified. Before she could step closer, the air shifted behind her. A chill ran down her spine. She turned slowly and saw Joseph standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his eyes wide and filled with a barely contained fury. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and dripping with menace. Madison stepped back, her heart hammering in her chest. Joseph took a step forward, blocking the only exit. "What are you hiding?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. Joseph smiled, a twisted, chilling smile that froze her blood. "It's too late for you now, Madison." "Too late?" Madison backed away, her eyes wide, as Joseph advanced slowly into the room. The candlelight cast twisted shadows across his face, making his expression even more menacing. "What is this, Joseph?" Madison asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though her heart pounded wildly in her chest. "I told you, you shouldn't be here," Joseph repeated, his voice low but seething with restrained anger. His eyes gleaming with something almost insane, locked onto her like a predator ready to strike. Madison's gaze darted quickly around the room, searching for any escape route. Her eyes stopped on the broken necklace atop the table, and beside it, an old photograph caught her attention. Trembling, she took a step forward and picked it up. It was an image of a small child, a girl with curly hair and the same necklace she now wore. Beside her stood a younger man, Joseph. Even in his youth, his face held the same hardness she had come to know so well. "Why?" Madison murmured, tears welling in her eyes. "What did you do, Joseph?" Joseph closed his eyes for a moment, as though her words physically struck him. When he looked back at her, his expression was that of a man consumed by desperation. "You don't understand," he said, his voice now unsteady but still tense. "I didn't want it to be this way. I never planned for this." "What did you do to me?" Madison demanded, gripping the photo tightly, tears streaming down her face. You were never supposed to come back," Joseph shouted, his voice exploding like thunder in the small room. He lunged toward her threateningly, but Madison was faster, darting around him and running out of the room. The hallway felt endless as Madison sprinted, her bare feet echoing against the wooden floors. She could hear Joseph behind her, his heavy, furious steps reverberating in the oppressive silence of the mansion. When she reached the main hall, she stumbled and fell to her knees but quickly scrambled back up. Looking back, she saw Joseph standing at the top of the staircase, his breathing heavy, his eyes darkened with rage. "You have no idea what you're about to destroy," he shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "I just want the truth," Madison cried, her voice breaking with emotion. "The truth?" Joseph let out a bitter, hollow laugh. "The truth will ruin everything." "What did you do to me?" she screamed again, her voice echoing through the entire mansion. Before Joseph could respond, a light flicked on in a nearby corridor, and William appeared wearing a dark robe. His expression was a mix of fury and confusion. "What is going on here?" William demanded, his voice grave and commanding. Madison ran to him, trembling and breathless. "Joseph, he knows something," she said, her voice frantic. "He's been hiding photos of me, of the necklace. He knows what happened to me." William turned to the butler, his expression turning to ice. "Joseph, what does this mean?" For a moment, Joseph stood frozen, but William stepped forward, his eyes blazing with anger. "Answer me now!" Joseph finally descended the first few steps, his figure defeated, his face crumbling. His voice came out low, almost a whisper. "I did what I thought needed to be done." "What did you do, Joseph?" William demanded, closing in, while Catherine appeared in the corridor, her face a mask of horror. "It was me," Joseph finally confessed. His face was pale, his voice shaking, almost unrecognizable. "I'm the one who took Madison 17 years ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Madison felt her legs weaken, and William for a moment seemed to lose his balance. "What?" William murmured, his voice barely audible. You always trusted me, Mr. William. I was always loyal, but when she was born, when I knew there would be an heir, I saw everything I had worked for slipping through my fingers. I feared being replaced. I was afraid of losing my place in this house. Joseph closed his eyes tightly, as though trying to block out the memories. It was desperation. William stepped forward with heavy, deliberate steps, his fists clenched. You're telling me you kidnapped my daughter, that you left her in a park like she was a discarded object? For the first time, Joseph looked small under William's fury. I thought that without an heir I would become indispensable to you, that you would depend on me forever. But I never thought she would survive. William grabbed Joseph by the collar, his eyes blazing with rage. You ruined our lives, he roared. You stole my daughter from me. You took years I can never get back. Catherine covered her mouth with her hands, sobbing, while Madison watched the scene, paralyzed, tears streaming freely down her face. You will pay for this, William said, shoving Joseph backward. I'm calling the police right now. Joseph didn't protest. His face was ashen and he looked utterly defeated. I did it to keep what was mine. And now I've lost everything, he murmured, sinking to the floor of the grand hall. William turned to Madison, gently placing his hands on her shoulders. Forgive me, my daughter. I didn't know a monster was living under my roof. Madison embraced her father, finally feeling the weight of the past begin to lift. Though the path that had brought her here had been tortuous, she now knew the truth. Joseph, the man who had watched her with disdain, who had treated her as a threat, was the same man who had stolen her from her family so many years ago. As the sound of police sirens echoed in the distance, Joseph remained on the floor, his eyes empty, murmuring softly to himself. All I ever wanted was to be important. And then, like a ghost of the past, he was taken away by the authorities, leaving behind only the remnants of his dark secrets. The police sirens echoed through the walls of the Harris mansion, shattering the silence that had always defined the place. Joseph, seated on the cold marble floor of the grand hall, stared blankly into space as two officers entered, their boots reverberating across the room. William stood tall and resolute, while Catherine tried to console Madison, who watched the scene unfold with a mix of relief and disbelief. Joseph Hughes, the older officer asked firmly, stepping closer. You are under arrest for kidnapping, unlawful concealment of a minor, and other charges to be formally presented. Joseph didn't resist. He looked like a man utterly drained of any will to fight. Slowly he rose to his feet, allowing the officers to cuff his hands. His eyes, now stripped of their former coldness, met Madison's for a brief moment. I never meant to hurt you, he murmured, his voice hoarse and broken. Not like this. Madison didn't respond. Tears filled her eyes, but they weren't for him. They were for everything he had stolen from her. Years of childhood, memories, the safety of a home. Joseph was escorted to the patrol car, and as the door closed behind him, it felt as though the mansion's final ghost had been exorcised. William stepped toward Madison and pulled her into an embrace. He can't hurt us anymore, William whispered gently. It's over. Madison nodded, but even as William tried to comfort her, she knew that the end of this story couldn't erase the scars Joseph had left behind. The days that followed were calm but not entirely peaceful. Joseph's absence, though a relief, left behind a shadow that lingered over the mansion. The other staff whispered in the hallways, shocked by the revelations. William and Catherine did everything they could to welcome Madison, as though their love might somehow make up for the lost years. In the sitting room on a rainy afternoon, William sat beside Madison on the couch, an album of old photos open on the table. I want you to know everything about us. About you, he said, turning the pages slowly. The images showed moments of happiness before the tragedy. Catherine smiling with a baby in her arms, the same heart-shaped necklace glistening around the child's neck. I've remembered this necklace for as long as I can remember myself, Madison murmured, touching the piece around her neck. I never knew what it meant. Now I do. William took her hand. It belonged to your mother. She gave it to you on your 2nd birthday. She always said it was a symbol of our love, that as long as you wore it, you would always be protected. Madison smiled faintly, her heart aching with bittersweet emotions. "That's what kept me alive all these years." William nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to hold on to a symbol anymore. We're here, and we always will be." The next day, William gathered all the mansion staff in the main hall. Catherine stood beside Madison, as proud as any mother could be. "As you all know," William began, his voice strong and authoritative, "Joseph no longer works in this house. The trust we placed in him was betrayed in the worst way possible. I want you to know that this house is starting a new chapter, one filled with hope and unity." The staff, though shocked, nodded respectfully. Some who had worked there for decades still couldn't believe that Joseph, the stern, loyal butler, had committed such a monstrous act. When the staff dispersed, Catherine squeezed Madison's hand. "You are part of this now, my dear. No matter what the past took from us, we will rebuild together." Madison smiled, feeling warmth in the gesture. For the first time, she truly felt she wasn't alone. A few days later, William invited Madison to visit the park, where she had been found 17 years earlier. It was a peaceful place, with tall trees and old wooden benches worn by time. Madison walked slowly through the area, each step stirring empty memories and confusing emotions. "It was here," William said, stopping beside an old rusted carousel. "This is where you disappeared." Madison touched the carousel's bar, closing her eyes. There were no memories, only a void, but somehow the place no longer seemed as frightening as it once had. "He left me here," she murmured, more to herself than to William. "But someone found me. Someone cared for me." William placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "And now you're home. We don't need to look back anymore." Madison smiled, feeling an invisible weight finally begin to lift. "No, we don't." The following week, William and Catherine fulfilled a promise they had made to Madison. As a symbolic gesture of a fresh start, the family embarked on a short trip to the coast, a place William and Catherine had often visited in their younger days. On the beach under the golden sun, Madison walked barefoot along the shore while William and Catherine watched from a distance. "She's smiling," Catherine said, tears in her eyes. "And I won't let her lose that smile ever again," William replied with determination. Madison stopped at the water's edge, gazing out at the horizon. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt no fear of the future. The ocean stretched out before her, endless and full of possibility. She touched the necklace gently, no longer as a lonely reminder, but as a symbol of strength, love, and reunion. "Thank you," she whispered softly, looking up at the sky, somehow knowing that everything was finally in its right place. The days grew lighter at the Harris mansion. The weight of old secrets had finally been lifted, like a shadow that for years had consumed the house. Madison's return had brought not only the reunion of a family, but also a rebirth for everyone. The mansion, once oppressive and silent, now echoed with laughter, hurried footsteps and voices filled with life. Madison adapted to her new routine little by little. William, proud and patient, began introducing her to the family business, teaching her everything with care and dedication. "You are strong, Madison," he told her during one of their meetings in the office. "The strength you've shown all these years, even without knowing who you were or where you came from, is something that can't be taught. It's part of you. It's what makes you special." Madison smiled at her father, finally feeling like she belonged. "I want to learn everything, Father," she replied firmly, still getting used to calling William by that name. "I want to honor the family that took me in." He nodded, his voice full of emotion. "And you will, my daughter, you will." Catherine, in turn, dedicated herself to building a maternal bond with Madison. The two spent entire afternoons in the garden, planting flowers and sharing stories. Catherine showed her old family photos, recounting the small details that made up the life Madison had missed. "You were always here," Catherine said one day, pointing to an old photo of herself while pregnant. "In my heart. Even when time told me to give up, I knew one day you'd come back to us." Madison hugged Catherine, feeling the warmth and security of that gesture. "Thank you for never giving up on me," she whispered. "Never. We are mother and daughter, and nothing in the world can change that," Catherine replied, tears glistening in her eyes. With Joseph gone and delivered to justice, William made an important decision. He chose to renovate parts of the mansion, transforming the empty and sorrowful rooms into spaces filled with life and hope. Madison took an active role in the changes, picking colors, furniture, and even decorative pieces. "This house needs to breathe again," William would say as he walked through the hallways alongside Madison. "For too long, it's been a mausoleum of secrets. Now, I want it to be a home." Her home. Madison helped redecorate the old hall where she had first found the clues about her past. Now, instead of shadows, sunlight streamed through the windows, filling the space with plants and vibrant new artwork. It was as though the mansion itself was finally being freed from the weight it had carried for so many years. A few months later, William, Catherine, and Madison organized a special trip, something symbolic to celebrate the start of a new chapter. They traveled to the coast, a place William and Catherine had visited on their honeymoon many years before. On the beach, under a clear sky and the infinite sea, Madison felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. She walked barefoot along the sand, William and Catherine just behind her, laughing together as a family finally reunited. William approached her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "What do you see, my daughter?" he asked. Madison looked toward the horizon, where the sky met the sea. "A new beginning," she replied with a smile. "For the first time, I don't feel lost." Catherine joined them, holding Madison's hand. "The future is yours, dear. Never let the past define you. It's a part of you, but it doesn't determine where you can go." Madison nodded, overcome with emotion. She touched the heart-shaped necklace, which now sparkled in the sunlight. The symbol that had once been her only connection to the past now meant so much more: love, family, and hope. "Thank you," she murmured, looking at her parents. William smiled, pulling them both into a warm embrace. Together always. When they returned to the mansion, Madison felt different. It was as if the young girl who had arrived months before, frightened, lonely, and distrustful, had vanished. In her place stood a woman who was strong, resilient, and ready to face the future. William continued to teach her about the family business, and Madison surprised everyone with her intelligence and dedication. She was seen not just as the Harris heir, but as a promise of renewal for the family. One afternoon, as she walked through the garden, Madison stopped in front of a bench beneath the shade of a tree. She closed her eyes, feeling the light breeze against her face, and smiled. "I did it," she whispered to herself. From above, the Harris mansion looked completely different. A house now alive with love, laughter, and hope. A place where the pain of the past had been replaced with unity and a brighter future. And at the center of it all was Madison, the girl who never gave up, who survived the shadows, and who found in the most unexpected place what she had always longed for: a family.